Don't make it weird, Margot. You always make these things weird. My aunt said it the way you'd swat a fly, barely looking at me while she refilled her wine glass at the head of my grandmother's dining table. It was the day after the funeral. We were supposed to be eating leftover ham and being a family. Instead, my aunt had just slid an envelope across the table to me with 2 fingers, like she didn't want to touch it longer than she had to. Inside was a check, my grandmother's handwriting, shaky but clear. Pay to the order of Margot. $40,000. It's not real, honey, my aunt said, and she actually laughed. It was a small, practiced laugh, the kind she used at parties. Mom wrote those in her last week's. She was confused. That account's been closed since before Christmas. We just didn't want to upset her, so we let her write them. It's a keepsake, a sweet little keepsake. My cousin, sitting across from me, took his envelope, the same kind, and held it up between 2 fingers and tore it in half, then in half again. He let the pieces flutter down onto his plate like confetti. There, he said, now nobody has to feel bad. My other cousin, his sister, giggled and did the same with hers, ripped it into a little pile next to the cranberry sauce. I sat there with my piece of paper in my hand and I felt my face go hot. I almost did it too. I almost tore it, just to make the laughing stop, just to be folded back into the warm circle of people who had known me my whole life and decided I was the one who made things weird. But my grandmother had pressed that envelope into my hands 3 days before she died. She'd been so thin by then, her wedding ring spinning loose on her finger. She'd held my wrist with more strength than I thought she had left, and she'd looked at me and said, "Cash it the day after." Not before. The day after. Promise me. And I'd thought it was the morphine talking. I'd said yes the way you say yes to a dying person, to soothe them. So I didn't tear it. I folded it once, slid it into the back pocket of my jeans, and I said, "I think I'll keep mine as a keepsake too." My aunt's smile flickered, just for a second. Just long enough that I noticed. Have you ever sat at a table full of people who raised you and realized, all at once, that not a single one of them was on your side? Tell me about it. I want to know I'm not the only one. I didn't sleep that night. I was staying at a motel off the interstate because nobody had offered me a guest room, even though my aunt's house had 4. I lay on the scratchy comforter and I held the check up to the lamp and I looked at the routing number. The account number. The date. It looked real. Everything about it looked real except for the laughing that kept replaying in my head. The next morning I was at the bank when it opened. Not the branch in my grandmother's town. I drove 40 minutes to the next county over, the way you do when you don't want anyone to see your car in the parking lot. I walked up to the counter and there was a teller, an older man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and I slid the check across to him and I said, "I need to know if this is good before I deposit it. I don't want to bounce anything." He picked it up. He looked at it the way you look at a check for $40,000 when the person handing it to you is a woman in a wrinkled funeral dress who clearly hasn't slept. He typed. He frowned at his screen. He typed again. I gripped the edge of the counter and I waited for him to slide it back to me and tell me, gently, that it was from a closed account, that my aunt was right, that I'd embarrassed myself driving 40 minutes to be told what everyone already knew. "This account's active," he said. "Funds are available." He looked up at me over the glasses. "You want the whole thing? Or you want to leave some in?" I had to ask him to say it again. He said it again. I deposited 35 and kept 5 in cash, and I sat in my car in that parking lot for a long time. It was January, and the heater was broken, and I could see my breath, and I just sat there holding the deposit slip. Available balance, $35,211. The 2-on-1 was mine, what was left of my savings after the plane ticket and the rental car, and 3 nights at a motel. The rest was hers, my grandmother's. Real money in a real account that my aunt had told me, less than 18 hours earlier, did not exist. You have to understand who I was in that family to understand why I started shaking in that cold car. And it wasn't from the temperature. I was the one who left. That was my whole identity. I'd moved from Ohio to Oregon when I was 23 to take a job nobody respected, doing something nobody understood. I'm an estate paralegal. I spend my days reading trust documents and probate filings and the fine print that nobody reads until it's too late. To my family, that meant I was a glorified secretary who'd run off to the West Coast to be a free spirit, which was the polite version. The impolite version, which my aunt used at Thanksgiving the year before, was that I'd abandoned the family to go file papers for strangers. Meanwhile, my cousin, the one who tore his check first, had been between opportunities for 6 years. He'd had a food truck that lasted one summer, a cryptocurrency thing, a consulting business with no clients, and every time the family money was there to catch him. When his food truck failed, my grandmother's account paid off the loan. When I asked for help with grad school, I was told the well was dry, that I needed to be more like my cousin and bet on myself. I remember the exact moment I understood the shape of it, sitting in that car. My grandmother had a trust. I knew this the way you know things in a family. Half rumor, half fact. It was supposed to be split between the grandchildren. But for years, my aunt had been the one managing it because she lived close, because she was good with that sort of thing, because my grandmother trusted her oldest daughter. And every time the subject came up at a holiday, my aunt would wave her hand and say the trust was complicated, that there were tax implications, that we'd all get our share when the time was right. The time, apparently, was never right. And now my grandmother was dead, and her account had $40,000 in it that my aunt had sworn was empty, and my aunt was the executor of the estate. The executor. The one person legally responsible for telling the truth about what was in it. I'm an estate paralegal. I read these documents for a living, and in that frozen car, I stopped being the family disappointment for a second, and I became someone who knew exactly what an executor lying about account balances meant. I went back, not to the motel, to my grandmother's house, the small one she'd kept even after she got sick, the one my aunt called the cottage, with a little curl of contempt because it wasn't grand enough. The key was where it had always been, under the third flower pot on the porch, the one with the dead geranium. My aunt hadn't changed the locks yet. She probably thought there was nothing in there worth changing them for. My grandmother had been a saver of paper, decades of it. And she had a filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, a beat-up metal one with a sticky drawer, and I sat on the floor in front of it in my coat because the heat was off, and I started reading. It took me 4 hours. I found the original trust document. I found the amendments. And then I found the thing that made my hands go still. My grandmother had named me, not just as a beneficiary, as successor trustee. If she became incapacitated or died, control of the trust passed to me, not to my aunt, to me. The document was signed and notarized 11 months earlier, right around the time my grandmother started getting sick, right around the time my aunt started telling everyone that Grandma was confused and not herself. My aunt had never been the trustee. She'd been acting like one. There's a difference, and it's the difference between managing money and stealing it. My phone buzzed. It was my aunt. "Where are you? We're doing the estate walkthrough tomorrow, and I need you to sign some things. Just routine. Don't make it complicated." I sat on that cold floor, and I read that text 4 times. Don't make it complicated. They'd been saying versions of that to me my whole life. Don't make it weird. Don't make it complicated. Don't be difficult. It was always me who was the problem, never the thing I was pointing at. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I kept digging. And that's when I found the bank statements. My grandmother had printed them every month in that careful way old people do, and I laid them out on the floor in order, going back 3 years, and I watched a story tell itself in numbers. Withdrawals, transfers, 18,000 here, 22 there, to an account I didn't recognize until I cross-referenced it with a checkbook register in the seam drawer. It was my aunt's account. The transfers had a pattern too. They spiked every time my cousin had a new opportunity. The food truck loan, a down payment that lined up exactly with the timing of my aunt's new car, a wire transfer for $30,000 the same month my cousin posted photos from a business trip to Cabo. Over 3 years, the transfers added up to a little over $400,000. My grandmother's trust, the one that was supposed to be split between 3 grandchildren, the one my aunt swore was complicated, had been a personal piggy bank. And my grandmother, in her last clear months, must have figured it out. That's why she changed the trustee to me. That's why she wrote those checks at the kitchen table while my aunt told everyone she was confused. She wasn't confused. She was trying to get the money out the only way she had left, into the hands of the one grandchild who'd actually read what she signed. Cash it the day after, not before. I finally understood. She knew that the moment she died, my aunt would freeze everything, would close accounts, would tell us all the checks were fakes. My grandmother had been counting on me to move faster than my aunt's grief act. I didn't sleep that second night either, but it was a different kind of not sleeping. I texted my aunt back in the morning. I'll be there for the walkthrough. I have some paperwork too. She sent back a thumbs up. She had no idea. I want to be honest about something. Part of me wanted to call her right then and scream. Part of me wanted to drive to her 4-bedroom house and throw the bank statements in her face on the porch. But I'd read enough estate fights to know how those end. They end with the person who screams looking unstable and the person who stays calm looking credible. My aunt was very, very good at looking like the calm one. So I decided to give her exactly the stage she thought she controlled and let her perform on it. The walkthrough was at my grandmother's lawyer's office, a man named Mr. Okafor who'd done my grandmother's documents for 30 years. My aunt had requested him specifically, which told me she didn't know what was in his files, because if she had, she'd have wanted anyone but him. We sat around a conference table, my aunt in a black blazer looking bereaved and competent, my 2 cousins, bored, checking their phones, and me in the same wrinkled dress because I hadn't packed for a war. My aunt took control immediately, the way she always did. "So, as everyone knows," she said, "I've been handling Mom's affairs. The estate is modest. The house, some personal effects, a small amount in checking. The trust was largely depleted by Mom's medical care over the last few years, which, I'll be honest, was a difficult thing to watch and to manage." She dabbed at her eye. She actually dabbed. Mr. Okafor folded his hands. "Depleted to what amount?" "There's about 11,000 left," my aunt said smoothly. "I have the statements." She slid a folder across the table, and I watched Mr. Okafor open it, and I watched something flicker across his face, and I realized he already knew. He drafted the successor trustee amendment. He knew who was supposed to be sitting in the driver's seat, and it wasn't her. "That's interesting," I said. It was the first thing I'd said all meeting, and everyone turned to look at me like the furniture had spoken, because the account my grandmother wrote my check from had 40,000 in it 3 days ago, and the check cleared yesterday. The room went very still. My aunt's laugh came out, that practiced little laugh. "Margot, sweetheart, that account is closed. I told you, those checks were. It's not closed. I deposited the check. The teller verified the account was active." I reached into my bag. I brought the deposit slip and the statements, the ones Grandma kept. I laid them on the table. 3 years of them in order. The way she'd taught me, in a way, by being the kind of woman who kept her papers in order. "These are transfers from the trust to a personal account ending in the same 4 digits as yours. $412,000 over 3 years. They line up with the food truck loan, the Cabo trip, your car." My cousin stopped looking at his phone. "You're confused," my aunt said, but her voice had changed. "You don't understand how trusts work. There are management fees. There are no management fees that look like a wire transfer to Cancun," I said. "I read trust documents for a living. That's the job you all thought was so embarrassing. Filing papers for strangers." I turned to Mr. Okafor. "I'd like to ask you something on the record, since we're all here. 11 months ago, did my grandmother execute an amendment naming a successor trustee?" Mr. Okafor looked at my aunt, and then at me, and there was something almost like relief in his face, the relief of a man who'd been holding something heavy for a long time. "She did," he said. "She was lucid. I asked her the standard competency questions myself. She named her granddaughter Margot as successor trustee, effective upon her death. He paused. Which means, as of 3 days ago, you, he looked at my aunt, have not had any legal authority over this trust at all. I had never heard a room get that quiet. My cousin set his phone face down on the table. Very gently, the way you set something down when you suddenly understand its evidence. This is insane, my aunt said. Mom was not in her right mind. She was on medication. I have people who will testify. You told everyone she was confused, I said, for 11 months. Right after she signed a document you didn't know about. I used to think you were managing her decline. You were getting ahead of it. You were building the story you'd need for exactly this moment. I slid the medical records I'd also found in the filing cabinet across the table, her own oncologist's notes. Her doctor documented that she was alert and oriented at every visit through last spring. There's no diagnosis of cognitive impairment. Anywhere, you made that part up. My aunt opened her mouth and nothing came out. Mr. Okafor cleared his throat. I'll need to be direct with everyone in this room because my obligation is now to the trustee who is Margot. A trustee who diverts trust assets for personal use has committed breach of fiduciary duty. In an amount this size, it's also a crime. There's no inheritance dispute here. There's a recovery action and very likely a referral. He looked at my aunt and his voice was not unkind, which somehow made it worse. You didn't lose your share today. You spent the last 3 years disqualifying yourself from one. My cousin spoke up then, the one who'd torn his check. I didn't know, he said fast. To me, to Mr. Okafor, to anyone. The food truck money, I thought it was a gift. I didn't know it was from the trust, I swear. You took an $80,000 food truck and a trip to Cabo while I was told the well was dry for grad school, I said. Maybe you didn't know where it came from, but you never once asked. There's a word for that too. Mr. Okafor can tell you what it is. It got worse from there for them, but I don't need to walk through all of it. The part that mattered was already done. They didn't escort anyone out of a conference room. It wasn't a movie. It was paperwork and phone calls and a forensic accountant my grandmother's lawyer recommended, and eventually a settlement my aunt signed because the alternative was a courtroom and a criminal referral, and even she could read the room by then. She paid back the $400,000, most of it, by selling the 4-bedroom house she'd always made sure to mention had a pool. My cousin gave back what he could, which wasn't much, but he wrote me a letter, an actual handwritten letter, that I haven't answered and don't know if I ever will. The trust got split the way my grandmother wanted. 3 ways, the cousins included, because that's what she would have done and because I'm not interested in becoming the next person who decides she knows better than the document. I just made sure the document was followed. That was the whole job. That was always the whole job. My aunt called me, once, a few months after everything settled. I let it go to voicemail. She said she hoped I was happy, that I'd torn the family apart, that I'd always made things complicated. I listened to it standing in the kitchen of the little cottage, my grandmother's cottage, which I'd kept, because it turned out the woman who left Ohio to go file papers for strangers wanted somewhere to come home to after all. I deleted the voicemail. I didn't make things complicated. I just stopped pretending they were simple. There's a thing people don't tell you about being the one who reads the fine print. They treat you like you're small, like noticing is a kind of pettiness, like keeping records is what you do because you have nothing better. And then one day, the fine print is the only thing standing between a dying woman's last wish and the people who'd already spent it. My grandmother knew that. She'd known it for 11 months. She picked me not because I was the favorite. She picked me because I was the one who'd actually read what she signed. Quiet isn't the same as weak. Sometimes quiet is just someone keeping the receipts, waiting for the day they're asked to count. For a long time, I believed my family was right about me, that I was the small one, the one who noticed too much, the one who made things complicated by keeping receipts nobody asked me to keep. It took my grandmother dying for me to understand that the thing they mocked in me was the exact thing she trusted. She didn't pick me to be successor trustee because I was loud or impressive. She picked me because I read what I signed, and she knew her oldest daughter never expected me to read anything at all. Here's what I keep coming back to. My aunt didn't get caught because I was clever in some movie way. She got caught because of 3 years of choices that each felt safe to her in the moment. Every transfer she told herself was fine. Every time she called my grandmother confused, she was building a story, and stories built on lies have seams, and seams always show to anyone patient enough to lay the pages out in order. The food truck, the car, the trip to Cabo. None of it was hidden well, because she never believed anyone would look. That was her real mistake, not greed. Contempt. She thought so little of the rest of us that she stopped covering her tracks. And my cousin, who tore his check first and laughed loudest, he learned the hardest part of all. You don't get to keep your hands clean by not asking where the money came from. Refusing to know is its own kind of choice. I felt that one in my chest because for years I'd done a quieter version of the same thing, telling myself the family was just the family, that the unfairness was something I had to swallow instead of something I had to swallow instead of something I could name out loud. If I learned anything worth passing on, it's this. Be the person who tells the truth, even when the truth is inconvenient, especially when staying quiet would be so much easier and so much warmer. That's the part that holds everything else up. But goodness on its own isn't enough, because the people who steal from you are usually counting on you to be too trusting to check. So learn the boring things, read the document, keep the statement, understand how the thing actually works, because knowing the rules is what turns being right into being able to prove it. And then, when your hands are shaking in a cold car and every voice you grew up with is telling you are overreacting, you have to be willing to keep going anyway, not loudly, just steadily. One more drawer, one more phone call, one more morning at a bank 40 minutes from home. My grandmother spent her last clear months betting that I'd be all three of those things at once. Honest enough to refuse the easy lie, careful enough to find the proof, and stubborn enough to follow it through to a conference table I was terrified to sit at. I almost wasn't. I almost tore that check with the rest of them. The whole rest of my life turned on a single folded piece of paper in my back pocket and a promise I made to a dying woman I assumed was confused. She wasn't confused. She was just waiting for someone to finally count.